London. Soho late at night, maybe 2 in the morning. 1967. Paul McCartney walked down the stairs into the Bag O' Nails Club. He'd been here dozens of times. It was one of his favorite spots. After long Beatles recording sessions at Abbey Road, Paul would come here to decompress, have a drink, watch whatever band happened to be playing. Most nights, the place was empty by this hour. Just a few stragglers. The serious musicians who couldn't sleep. The night owls. The people for whom music wasn't a job, it was an obsession. Tonight was no different. The Bag O' Nails was nearly deserted. Paul settled in with his drink, ready for nothing in particular. Just another late night in a dark basement club in Soho. And then he heard a sound. The distinctive clunk of a jack plug being pushed into an amplifier. The hum of electricity waiting to become music. Paul looked toward the stage in the corner. 3 musicians were setting up. Or rather, they'd already set up and were about to play. A young black man with a wild afro, holding a Fender Stratocaster. A bassist with long hair. A drummer positioning himself behind a minimal kit. Paul didn't recognize them. Hadn't heard of them. But something about the way the guitarist held his instrument made Paul stay. The way his fingers rested on the strings. The confidence in his posture. The ease with which he wore that guitar, like it was part of his body, an extension of his nervous system. The 3 musicians launched into their set, playing to virtually no one. Playing as if they were at Wembley Stadium instead of a nearly empty basement club at 2 in the morning. And Paul McCartney, who'd played thousands of shows, who'd seen every great musician of his generation, who knew talent when he encountered it, watched that guitarist and understood immediately. This was different. Not just good, not just technically skilled. Different in a fundamental way. I was one of the first people to see him in London, Paul would say years later, and it was mind-blowing. When did he know? When did the realization hit? Probably the first minute. The first second that he started playing guitar. 1 second. That's all it took for Paul McCartney to understand he was witnessing the future. The guitarist's name was Jimi Hendrix. And this empty club at 2 in the morning was about to become the most important room in rock and roll. To understand what Paul McCartney heard that night, you have to understand where he was in his own musical journey and where Jimi had come from. January 1967. The Beatles had stopped touring 5 months earlier. No more screaming crowds drowning out the music. No more playing the same songs the same way every night. They'd retreated to Abbey Road studios to create, to experiment, to push the boundaries of what recording could accomplish. They were in the middle of making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album that would redefine rock music. Multi-track recording, orchestra sections, sound effects, songs that bled into each other. A complete artistic statement. Paul was at the peak of his creative powers, writing some of the best songs of his career, innovating in the studio, thinking about music in ways no one had before. And yet, he still came to the Bag O' Nails late at night, still wanted to hear live music, still needed to connect with what was happening on the streets, in the clubs, where musicians played not for money or fame, but for the pure joy of it. Meanwhile, Jimi Hendrix had arrived in London just 4 months earlier, September 1966. An unknown guitarist from New York, discovered by Chas Chandler, former bassist of the Animals. Jimi had been grinding it out in America for years, playing backing guitar for artists like Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Curtis Knight. Never quite finding his own voice. Never getting the recognition he deserved. In New York clubs, Jimi was just another session guitarist. Talented, sure. But in a city full of talented musicians, that wasn't enough. He was playing other people's music, following other people's rules, supporting other people's stars. Until Linda Keith, girlfriend of Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, saw him play at the Cheetah Club in Manhattan and understood, this is different. This needs to be heard. She tried to get him signed, contacted producers. Nothing worked, until she told Chas Chandler, who'd just left the Animals to become a manager. Chas saw Jimi play and immediately knew, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. He convinced Jimi to move to London, formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience with 2 British musicians, Noel Redding on bass, Mitch Mitchell on drums. And in London, specifically in clubs like the Bag O' Nails, Jimi found what he'd never found in America, an audience that got it, that understood what he was trying to do, that wasn't threatened by his innovation but excited by it. By January 1967, Jimi had been in London for 4 months, had released 1 single, Hey Joe, which was climbing the UK charts. Word was spreading fast. There's this American guitarist who's unlike anyone we've ever seen. But he was still building, still finding his audience, still proving himself night after night in small clubs. The Bag O' Nails on Kingly Street in Soho became one of his proving grounds. A tiny basement club, cramped, sweaty, dimly lit. The kind of place where you could smell the beer and cigarettes before you even descended the stairs. The stage was just a corner platform. Nothing fancy, but it had become a meeting place for London's musicians. The Who, the Animals, Eric Burdon, Georgie Fame. Anyone who mattered in the scene came through. Paul loved it because it was real, unpretentious, a place where music happened organically, without the machinery of the industry grinding away in the background. So when he walked in that night, exhausted from a recording session, looking for nothing more than a drink and maybe some background music, he wasn't expecting his world to be rearranged. But that's exactly what happened. The guitarist on that corner stage didn't play like anyone Paul had ever seen. Not better. Different. Operating according to rules Paul didn't recognize. The way his right hand attacked the strings, not strumming but assaulting them, coaxing sounds that shouldn't exist from a piece of wood and wire. The way his left hand moved across the fretboard with impossible speed and precision. The way he bent notes until they screamed. But it wasn't just technical ability. Paul had seen technically skilled guitarists before. Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page. All brilliant. This was something else. This was a complete integration between musician and instrument. Like watching someone speak a language they'd been born knowing. Fluent beyond fluent. Native. The guitarist would play a phrase that seemed simple, just a few notes. And somehow those notes contained more emotion, more story, more truth than entire songs by other artists. He'd hit feedback, and instead of pulling away from it, he'd lean into it. Control it. Make it musical. Turn noise into melody. He'd play behind his back, not as a gimmick, but as a natural extension of his performance, as if the guitar needed to be there, in that position, to create the sound he heard in his head. And his face. God, his face. Eyes closed sometimes. Lips moving slightly, as if he was having a conversation with the music. A slight smile when he hit a particularly satisfying phrase. Complete presence. Absolute focus. Paul watched, transfixed. The club was essentially empty. Maybe 5 people scattered around. The bartender cleaning glasses. A couple of die-hard music fans. That was it. And these 3 musicians, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, though Paul didn't know the name yet, were giving everything. Playing as if thousands were watching. Playing for the music itself. Paul understood that commitment. The Beatles had started the same way. Liverpool clubs. Hamburg. Tiny rooms where they'd played for hours, developing their craft, finding their sound. But there was something about watching it happen in front of him. Watching this unknown guitarist pour his soul into a performance for virtually no one. That moved Paul deeply. This was pure. This was what music was supposed to be. Not the machinery. Not the fame. Just the connection between musician and instrument and audience, however small that audience might be. Paul stayed for the entire set. Didn't move. Barely touched his drink. Just watched. And listened. And understood. What Paul didn't know that night was that this wasn't even the main event. Earlier that same evening, January 11th, 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had played 2 official shows at the Bag O' Nails. Scheduled performances. Promoted. Attended by virtually every important musician in London. The word had been spreading for weeks. There's this American guitarist playing London clubs who's unlike anyone we've ever seen. And they'd all come to witness it. Ringo Starr had been there. Pete Townsend and John Entwistle from The Who. Bill Wyman from the Rolling Stones. Eric Clapton, fresh off his time with Cream, considered a guitar god in his own right. Georgie Fame, Gino Washington, Denny Lane, Donovan. The basement had been packed. Sweaty bodies pressed together. The air thick with anticipation. And Jimmy had delivered. 2 explosive sets. Showing everyone what he could do. Playing guitar behind his head, with his teeth between his legs. Making sounds they'd never heard before. One by one, the major British guitarists had left that club understanding that the rules had changed. That Jimi Hendrix had just moved the goalposts for what guitar playing could be. Pete Townsend would later say that following Jimmy on stage was impossible. Eric Clapton's confidence as God had been shaken. Jeff Beck understood he needed to completely rethink his approach. But Paul had missed those sets. He'd been at Abbey Road, working on Beatles material. By the time he arrived at the Bag O' Nails, the official shows were over. The crowds had dispersed. Everyone had gone home. Except Jimi. Jimi, Noel Redding, and Mitch Mitchell had stayed. Maybe they were too wired from the performance to leave. Maybe they just wanted to keep playing. Maybe they understood that the magic happens not in the official shows, but in these unguarded moments when no one's watching. So they set up again and played. To an empty room. To 5 people. To the music itself. And Paul McCartney, by pure chance, by pure luck, walked in and witnessed it. In some ways, this was the more important performance, because it showed Jimi's commitment wasn't about the audience size. It wasn't about who was watching. It was about the music. Always the music. Paul recognized that immediately, because he'd had that same commitment. Still had it. Despite the fame and the screaming crowds and the machinery of Beatlemania, Paul had never lost sight of why he'd picked up an instrument in the first place. Because music was the only language that could express what words couldn't. And here was someone who spoke that language fluently. Better than fluently. Natively. The set ended. The musicians began packing up their equipment. The club prepared to close for the night. Paul sat there, processing what he'd just witnessed. He didn't rush the stage. Didn't introduce himself. Didn't make a scene. That wasn't Paul's style. He observed. Absorbed. Thought about what he'd seen. But he knew. Absolutely knew. That he'd just witnessed something significant. Someone significant. The next day, Paul would start telling people about Jimi Hendrix. Anyone who'd listen. This guy is incredible. You have to see him. He's different from anyone playing right now. And Paul had credibility. He was a Beatle. One of the most influential musicians on the planet. When Paul McCartney said someone was special, people paid attention. But that advocacy, that championship of Jimi's talent, started in this moment. In an empty club at 2 in the morning, watching a guitarist play his heart out to virtually no one. It wasn't just that one night, of course. Paul would see Jimi play many times over the coming months. He'd see the official shows where Jimi commanded packed rooms and left audiences stunned. He'd witness the theatricality, the guitar tricks, the stage presence, the sexuality and danger that Jimi brought to performance. But it was this first encounter, this accidental, intimate, unguarded moment, that stayed with Paul. Because it showed him who Jimi really was. Not the showman. Not the performer. The musician. The artist. The person for whom playing guitar wasn't a choice, but a necessity. Paul would tell this story for the rest of his life. At concerts, in interviews, whenever Jimi's name came up. I certainly loved Jimi. I was one of the first people to see him in London, and it was mind-blowing. I was in a club late at night called the Bag of Nails, which is actually where I met Linda, and it was empty. I heard this sort of clunking noise, the sound of a jack plug going into a big amp, and it was Jimi, Noel, and Mitch. It was the Jimi Hendrix Experience on the stage in the corner, and they played their whole act to virtually no one. Probably the first minute. The first second that he started playing guitar. 1 second. That's all it took. The impact of that night rippled outward in ways Paul couldn't have predicted. In February 1967, just a few weeks after the Bag O' Nails encounter, Paul was invited to do a blind date feature for Melody Maker magazine. Musicians would review new singles without knowing who the artist was. When Jimi's Purple Haze came on, Paul didn't even pretend to be blind to it. Must be Jimi Hendrix, Paul said immediately, then launched into genuine praise. So, Jimi freaks out and sounds all the better for it. It's breaking out all over the place, you know? I thought it would be one of those things that people might keep down, but it's breaking through all over. You can't stop it. Hooray. This is a good record too. That wasn't a musician being polite. That was Paul McCartney, at the absolute peak of his creative powers, while making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, taking time to publicly champion an emerging artist. And it mattered, because Paul was a Beatle. When he spoke, the industry listened. But Paul's advocacy went beyond just words. He used his influence in tangible ways. In June 1967, when the Monterey Pop Festival was being organized in California, Jimi needed to be on that bill. But he was still virtually unknown in America. His singles had flopped. He was a UK sensation who couldn't break through at home. Paul picked up the phone, called John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, one of the festival organizers. You have to have Jimi Hendrix. He's incredible. Paul's endorsement convinced them. Jimi got the slot. And on June 18, 1967, Jimi played Monterey. Set his guitar on fire. became an instant American legend. That performance, which launched Jimmy's U.S. career, which made him a star in his own country, happened because Paul McCartney had walked into an empty club at 2 in the morning 5 months earlier and recognized genius when he saw it. There's a detail about the Bag O' Nails that adds another layer to this story. The club wasn't just where Paul discovered Jimmy. It was also where Paul met Linda Eastman on May 15, 1967, the woman who would become his wife. Linda was a photographer. She'd come to London to shoot musicians. She was at the Bag O' Nails that night for a Georgie Fame concert. Paul was there too. They met, connected, started a relationship that would last until Linda's death in 1998. So the Bag O' Nails became, for Paul, a place of double significance. The place where he discovered the greatest guitarist of the generation, and the place where he met the love of his life. Paul would joke about this later. The Bag O' Nails is where I met Linda, and also where I first saw Jimmy. I have good instincts about that place. Good instincts indeed. The Bag O' Nails itself was a remarkable place in the landscape of 1960s London. Located at 9 Kingly Street in Soho, it was just a basement. Nothing fancy, but it had become the epicenter of the London music scene. The venue hosted early gigs by countless legendary artists. Not just Jimmy, though Jimmy's performances there would become the stuff of myth, but virtually everyone who mattered. Eric Burdon and the Animals were regulars. The Who played there. Tom Jones. Georgie Fame had practically made it his home base. After Beatles recording sessions, Paul, Ringo, and their roadie Mal Evans would often head to the Bag O' Nails for dinner and drinks. It was one of their favorite spots, a place where they could relax, watch live music, feel connected to the scene they'd come from. The club had a specific energy, intimate, unpretentious, real, the kind of place where musicians played for each other, not for crowds or critics or the machinery of the industry. In that environment, that crucible of talent and commitment and pure love of music, Jimi Hendrix had found his first British audience, and Paul McCartney had found his next obsession. Jimmy would later say he loved playing the Bag O' Nails. The intimacy of it, the way the audience was right there, close enough to touch, the way every note mattered because there was nowhere to hide. Britain is really groovy, Jimmy remarked after one of his early Bag O' Nails shows. Not a surprising observation considering the club backed onto the ultra-hip Carnaby Street, the center of 1960s London fashion and culture. For Jimmy, fresh from New York, where he'd been grinding it out in clubs and backing other artists, never quite finding his voice, London was a revelation. Here, people got it. Got him. Appreciated what he was trying to do. And the Bag O' Nails, more than anywhere else, was where that appreciation first took root. The club was where Jimmy could experiment, try things, push boundaries. The audience there, made up largely of other musicians, understood what he was doing. They recognized innovation when they heard it. It was the perfect incubator for what Jimmy would become. And Paul McCartney, by walking in at just the right moment, got to witness the birth of a legend. Years later, decades later, Paul would still tell the story of that first encounter. At concerts, he'd sometimes introduce a song by talking about Jimmy, about the Bag O' Nails, about how sometimes you just know when you're in the presence of greatness. I knew from the first second, Paul would say, and you could hear in his voice that he wasn't exaggerating, that it really had been that immediate, that profound, because genius recognizes genius. Talent recognizes talent. Paul had spent his entire life around music, had played with John Lennon and George Harrison, had seen Little Richard perform, had jammed with countless musicians, had absorbed influences from rock and roll, blues, classical, avant-garde, everything. He knew what mastery looked like, what it felt like to be in a room with someone operating at the highest level. And that night at the Bag O' Nails, watching Jimmy play to an empty room, Paul knew he was witnessing mastery. The story of Paul discovering Jimmy at the Bag O' Nails is often told as a feel-good anecdote. A famous musician supporting an emerging artist. A moment of cross-generational respect. But it's more than that. It's a reminder that great art doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it happens in empty rooms at 2 in the morning. Sometimes only 5 people witness it. Sometimes the most important moments are the quietest ones. It's also a reminder of the role advocacy plays in artistic careers. Jimi Hendrix had extraordinary talent, but talent alone doesn't guarantee success. Someone has to see it. Someone has to say, this matters. This person deserves to be heard. Paul McCartney did that for Jimmy. Used his platform, his credibility, his influence to open doors that might have stayed closed. And Jimmy, though he'd likely have found his way eventually, because talent that profound can't be suppressed forever, got there faster, got there bigger, got there with the validation of having a Beatle in his corner. January 11th, 1967. The Bag O' Nails. 2 in the morning. A nearly empty club. A guitarist playing his heart out. A famous musician who happened to walk in at exactly the right moment. The first second, Paul said, that's all it took. 1 second to recognize genius. And from that second, a friendship, an advocacy, a mutual respect that would influence both their careers. Paul would go on to champion Jimmy publicly and privately, would help get him to Monterey, would defend him against critics who didn't understand what he was doing. And Jimmy, 3 days after Sgt. Pepper's release in June 1967, would honor Paul by learning the title track and opening his show with it while Paul watched from the audience. A gesture of respect that Paul would call the ultimate compliment. 2 artists, 2 geniuses, meeting in a basement club at 2 in the morning. The kind of moment that only happens when music is the only thing that matters. London, Soho, the Bag O' Nails. Late at night, the sound of a jack plug going into an amplifier, the hum of electricity waiting to become music, and Paul McCartney, looking toward the stage in the corner, about to have his world rearranged. The first second that he started playing guitar. That's all it took.